Morden.
Thank you, Mr. Robertson. Thank you for the opportunity to have this debate. Before Christmas, social tenants in my constituency were sent a letter telling them that government changes in April will mean they'll have to pay more rent or move on, as they were deemed by the government to be over-occupying their home. These are the victims of what's now called the bedroom tax. As all honourable members know, this type of letter has gone out right across Wales in the UK, and it certainly in my constituency caused huge fear. I've asked for this debate because I'm absolutely horrified by some of the stories constituents are now telling me about what this one policy will mean to them, their families, their future and their home. Because for many in my communities, in my constituencies, these are their homes. You know, these are the homes they have cared for, they've cherished, they've lived in for decades, they've brought up their children, they've cared for their grandchildren, and are full of memories of lost loved ones. The fear is palpable as the reality of what these changes will mean sinks in. As one woman put it when I knocked her door the week she'd received the letter from Newport City Homes, she said to me, "Why did I get this? I thought this was about the scroungers, not about me." This April, these tenants face the stark choice of either paying between £40 to £80 more a month or having one or more spare bedrooms or moving to a smaller property. The evidence is there that many can't pay because as the cost of living and benefits cuts begin to hit, as one tenant in a Welsh study put it, they are not living but surviving already. What's more, there's a chronic shortage of smaller housing, particularly in Wales. There will be two levels of... I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. Would she, with me, pay tribute to Duncan Forbes of Bronavon, who's actually highlighted some of the nonsense of this particular tax, and particularly on the issue of going into one-bedroom houses. In Bronavon, in my constituency, 85 tenants will need to go to one-bedroom houses to avoid the tax. That will take 17 years to rehouse them.
I thank my right honourable friend for that intervention, and he is exactly right. And I would ask the Minister to look very carefully at the report from Bronavon in Torfaen, because it highlights very specific examples of why this policy will hit Wales especially hard, and I thank him for that intervention. There will be two levels of reduction. Those who are under-occupying by one bedroom will lose 14% of their housing benefit, which is equivalent to a loss of £12 a week. For those under-occupying by two or more bedrooms, there's a £25 reduction equivalent to a loss of £22 per week. In Wales, this hits 46% of all housing benefit claimants of working age in the social rented sector, compared to a UK average of 31%. In their own impact assessment, the Department of Work and Pensions say that 40,000 tenants are affected by the bedroom tax in Wales, with an average loss of income of £12 per week. Like many of the government's benefit changes, this is hitting Wales disproportionately hard. At a time when tax and benefit changes to be implemented by 2014-15 will mean that on average Welsh households in Wales can expect to lose 4.1% of their income, about £1,110 a year, on top of rising food and heating costs. In Newport, there were 1,794 Newport City Homes tenants who've received letters from the association telling them they're going to be affected. And there are a further 421 in receipt of letters who went from Monmouthshire housing, of which communities like Caldecott are in my constituency. With 4,220 on the Newport Common Housing Register and 2,536 on the Monmouthshire Common Housing Register, it's not rocket science to see that there's just not enough social housing for people to move to. Of the Newport City Homes tenants affected, 359 have two bedrooms too many, 1,435 have one bedroom too many, and of these, 916 are going to be looking for one bedrooms houses or flats and 823 for two bedroom properties. When you consider that Newport City Homes only have 1,264 one-bedroom properties in total and 2,682 bedroom properties, and that this week there are just 36 properties advertised on the Newport Housing Options website, you can see that people are going to have very few choices. We have very few, we have whole estates in Wales where there are very few one or two bedroom houses. I would give way to my...
Absolutely.
Putting the case very clearly in terms of an urban context. Would you agree that areas like mine, rural areas, which have faced a housing crisis for years, face added less choice, if there could be such a thing, in terms of the pressures we face in rural Ceredigion? And I'm sure she's going to mention also the particular fears that have been raised by people living in houses with disabled adaptations. Though there is more money coming from the government, it's been less than clear how that money is going to reach our constituents.
Right.
I thank the honourable friend for that. I will come on to mention that, and I know other honourable members have raised with me that issue of disabled people with disabled children, but also the issue of rural housing, where, as you say, there is very little stock there available for people to rent anyway. If I just give the example of the Underwood estate in my constituency on the outskirts of Newport, it's got 138 three-bedroom properties, 45 two-bedroom properties and no one-bedroom flats, apart from 12 that are reserved for pensioners and disabled people. In the past, we needed larger properties, and that's what councils built, but Wales will be hit hard because of a relative shortage of smaller housing. And Newport is not alone, as many housing associations across Wales are faced with exactly the same issue. The problem of a scarcity of larger properties is a problem in big cities in England. In Wales, it's the smaller properties that are more scarce. I would give way.
Undoubtedly an important debate in a Welsh context. Does she share my surprise, however? The point she makes about the shortage of smaller properties in Wales is one I fully accept. But does she share my surprise, therefore, that the Wales and West Housing Association have decided that the policy of the coalition governments will be imposed on all tenants, regardless of whether they're on housing benefits or not? Surely that is a restriction of people who might be willing to pay the going rates for a three-bedroom house.
I'm here to talk about this particular under-occupancy and housing benefit, and I appreciate the point he's making, but I want to kind of continue to make that point. Even if you're able to move, many families, even if you are able to move, many families who have to leave a community like Underwood will often be leaving behind a family who are able to care for children unpaid while they work. I can't be alone in meeting in my surgeries those who seek houses near their parents precisely so that they can help to look after them or the children. And those with two children of the same sex under 16 could have to move to a two-bedroom property. And in somewhere like Underwood, again, the likelihood is the children would have to move schools with all the disruption that would cause. I would give way.
I think she's making a very powerful point on securing the debate. But does she agree with me there's an inflexibility in the system and the fact that you could have children of the same sex sharing a bedroom, however far they are apart in ages, and also single parents will be penalised for not having rooms so their children can stay in there as well?
I agree with my honourable friend, and I'll come on to make those points. And again, it's the study by Bonavon in Torfaen highlights that particularly, where there's particular cases of which that mentions. Faced with no social housing and the need to stay in a community, it's hardly surprising, that nonetheless shocking, that one of the findings of a survey of social housing tenants, again by Bonavon and Torfaen, was that some tenants had concluded that the only possible solution for them was that if they ate 2 less meals a week to make up the shortfall, as it was the only area they could think to economise it. I will give way.
Does my honourable friend not think that realistically many families are going to fall very, very behind with their rent, with the result that they're actually going to find themselves either moved about or trying to move to smaller properties, or at the end of the day homeless? And what does she think our local authorities can possibly do with their limited resources to deal with the whole sea of people that won't have anywhere to go?
I thank my honourable friend for that point, and it's true that stress will be forced on the housing associations and on the local authorities and on the Welsh Assembly, who will not possibly be able to mitigate, although they will try, the effects of this policy, which we'll come on to later. With the chronic shortage of available housing, many tenants appear to feel there's no alternative but to be forced into arrears or have to resort to desperate measures like loan sharks or payday loans. Families would be forced into financial difficulties and rent arrears. Steve Clark, who's the Chief Executive of the Welsh Tenants Federation, estimates that 10% of tenants who are going to be affected are already indebted to their landlords because they're seeking repossession orders. The double whammy of rent arrears and these increases could mean these 4,000 presented themselves as homeless. This against a backdrop of food banks in Newport giving out hundreds more parcels a month, and food crime up 26% over the last 2 years. And we're talking about people stealing washing powder here. It appears the government think that people will find it easy to get extra hours work, find that elusive job, or that lone parents with small children or disabled children should go out and seek lodgers. In fact, the findings of the Community Housing Cymru hotline, Your Benefits Are Changing, hotline found that 13% of people who rang would consider downsizing, 8% might consider a lodger, but that 79% said that a lodger or moving were unsuitable options and would apply for discretionary housing payments. £7 million, I believe, has been allocated for Wales, placing a potential loss of £25 million. And this is the answer, the government's answer for those who can't move. There's a limited amount of money by the government to award these payments, but once this money's been used, no other payments can be made. And I take the point made earlier by the honourable member about no clarification about how this money will be spent. So the deserving may miss out if they happen to be in need when the fund has been exhausted. There's been no compelling analysis on the impact of these changes will have on individuals, and the government's response of giving a finite budget without knowing whether this will be sufficient is as callous as the bedroom tax itself. I give way to my honourable friend.
Does my honourable friend agree with me that one of the most telling aspects of the legislation is the fact that there are no exemptions for severely disabled people, and that the fund that is available will very quickly be used up by, for example, adults with severe learning disabilities who, in all genuineness, cannot take lodgers to premises where they have particular needs and have particular circumstances which are not conducive to sharing accommodation.
I agree very much with my honourable friend, and that's a very important point I think we have to bear in mind. There is also the point of those who've had disabled adaptations already done to their property, if they're forced to move, will then have to have another set of disabled adaptations, and it's not clear about with the discretionary payments quite what will happen in those circumstances. I give way to my right honourable friend.
Very grateful for giving away for the second time, but she's referred to the report by Bron Avon, and which says that the total budget for discretionary housing payments in Torfaen is just under £53,000. That's £6.62p per housing benefit claimant.
My right honourable friend makes a telling point, and when that money's gone, it's gone, and it's a very small amount of money and a drop in the ocean for what's needed. With no money to spare and no chance of social housing, tenants may look to the private rented sector, and this is where the policy has no logic if the stated policy aim of the reform is to save money. In many areas in Wales, the policy encourages tenants to move to more expensive accommodation in the private rented sector, which will increase expenditure, not decrease it, even with a reduced local housing allowance. In Torfaen, for instance, every single private rented property is more expensive than the Bron Avon rented properties. It's clearly a ridiculous situation, and just a cursory look on the website of private rented accommodation in my constituency also tells that tale. These are well-rehearsed arguments, but they're becoming more pressing as this policy becomes more real for many in Wales. Like the constituent I visited before Christmas, who lives in a very small two-bedroomed house in the community he grew up in and his family still live in. He was made redundant last April from his manufacturing job. He'd been in for 20 years, and he now finds himself on housing benefit. He's a proud man who's lost his job and now faces moving, well, it is in his immaculate home of many years. He currently pays £321 per month, and there's only one other one-bedroom property in Newport on the housing options list that he could possibly be eligible to rent this week, which would cost him £350 a calendar month. If he's still unemployed, this increased rent would still be covered by his housing benefit, but would cost the public purse an extra £341 a year. Or the tenant of Bron Avon, who's a former serviceman with post-traumatic stress disorder, whose benefit has been cut as he's deemed fit to work even though he's got serious depression. His daughter hopes to go to university, but her decision is going to be heavily influenced on what happens to her father's benefit. It's worth pointing out that spare rooms for those in our services are not out of the scope of this policy, and this will have a huge impact on South Wales. Or like the divorced father I met who has his kids to stay at the weekend, one of the hardest hit groups will be parents living in two-bedroomed houses with access to children, and if under 35 expected to share accommodation, which may be the only housing left to them, with all the child protection issues that then starts to raise, which is a whole other subject for debate. In Wales, registered social landlords expect a large loss of revenue, and they're in difficulty running large arrears. There will be pressure to make people homeless. This in turn will put pressure on local authorities to house those presenting themselves as homeless. The Welsh Assembly has made money available under the homelessness grants programmes and help with financial inclusion work and projects with shelter, but the reality is they won't be able to mitigate against the very real impact these reforms will have on Wales. There are so many unintended consequences for individual people, for instance, foster carers, people with disabled adaptations, disabled children, parents of disabled children. I'm sorry there's not time to do them justice here. A constituent from Alway, and he specifically asked me to say this, said that he considers the Prime Minister to be Dick Turpin without the mask. Many in the government think that paying an extra £20 a week towards rent will be the difference between going out for dinner or staying at home, but for many on low incomes it's heating or eating. Paying up when you can't afford it and then getting into debt or moving out and away from your community. This is a policy which in the long run can't cost less in Wales and will do nothing to help local housing pressures, as the pressure is on the smaller properties already. Regardless of the rhetoric, the fact is that the people worst affected are parents who share access to their children, grandparents who provide essential childcare for their grandchildren, allowing parents to go to work, and even kind of brave men and women serving in our armed forces. I think the government simply don't understand how this will affect people, and what's worse, they don't seem to care. We used to talk about the poverty trap, we're now talking about the property trap.
Yay.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Robertson. And can I first of all congratulate the Honourable Lady on securing this debate, and it's good to see a number of honourable members who've taken part. What I'll try to do is respond to her and to the points that she's raised. In general, I'll take interventions from her, but not from other honourable members until we've got near the end of the time. Just to set the context, because obviously we want to focus on the impact of the policy on Wales, and I want to respond to some of her particular points. But just for the record, the reason that the government is seeking to take £18 billion a year of what we spend on social security and tax credits is because of the vast amount of borrowing that we had to deal with. So it's not that the government woke up one morning and thought, wouldn't it be nice to cut people's housing benefit? We have to stop a situation where for every £3 the government was raising in tax, it was spending £4. That's unsustainable. It's not fair to the children who we are expecting to pay our debts. So that is why the government is looking to save money on social security. Housing benefit is a vast and rapidly rising bill and inevitably had to be looked at. So within the housing benefit budget, what can be looked at? Well, we've looked at private sector rent, we've looked at shared accommodation for younger people. Within the social sector, there are two reasons why spare bedrooms, where they are spare bedrooms, need to be looked at. The first is the unfairness between social tenants and private tenants. At present, a private tenant cannot have housing benefit for a property with spare bedrooms. They can only have housing benefit for a property for the size that they need. But a social tenant living next door can have housing benefit for a bigger house, and that is an unfairness. Now, at a time when we're trying to take costs out of the system to deal with the deficit, being fairer to private tenants, not giving social tenants an advantage over and above the advantage they already have through a subsidised rent, is an issue of fairness. There's also an issue of fairness in the system about people who are overcrowded. There was absolutely no mention in the Honourable Lady's speech about people who are living in overcrowded accommodation. If we have a limited social housing stock, and frankly successive governments have failed to build enough social houses, it's a finite stock. A social house with a subsidised rent is a very valuable thing. We absolutely owe it to those who are overcrowded to make maximum use of the housing stock. Now, getting from here to there is a painful and difficult process. I accept that. But many housing associations and social landlords around Britain have been creative and imaginative, have moved people. Now, accept it will be different from area to area, but have been creative about moving people who are in overcrowded accommodation into family homes, finding places for people in overcrowded accommodation, under-occupied accommodation to move. So it's not just a static case of on the register this week there are only so many empty properties. Social landlords have to start getting to know their tenants much better than they have in the past. All too often they haven't done that. And this process, I accept a difficult transition, should lead to a better use of the social housing stock. Of course I will.
Would the Minister accept you can be creative without being cruel, and that in fact you could go to and work far more closely with housing associations about asking them to do more about under-occupancy, but that this just kind of broad brush approach in April is going to hurt many people?
Saving money.
Well, it is about, the Honourable Gentleman said it's about saving money. That's absolutely, it's about. So I apologise for not respecting him enough. The right Honourable Gentleman, he corrects me from a sedentary position, the right Honourable Gentleman said it's about saving money. And I don't apologise for the fact that we have had to save money, because otherwise we just pile up debts for our children, and that's not progressive wherever you are on the political spectrum. Now, on her specific point, yes, of course, in theory, successive governments have tried to work with housing associations and social landlords, and it's not worked. because we have the best part of 1 million empty bedrooms paid for by housing benefit at the same time as we have thousands of people in overoccupied accommodation. So, overcrowded accommodation. So the challenge is to use the need to save money, to create fairness between private and social tenants, and to create fairness between people who are living in overcrowded accommodation and those who have spare bedrooms. Now, she said, no, I want to respond to the Honourable Lady. She said, these are the lifetime homes of some people, and I entirely accept that. That is why we've exempted pensioners as a group. So there's a set of pensioners who have spare rooms, living in the home they've occupied all their lives, and we are not touching them for the reason that she gives. For those who are below pension age, clearly there are a range of ways they can respond to this. It will be different for every person. So, as she said, for some people, for example, we're often told some of the people in social housing and on housing benefit are in work. The average £12 shortfall in Wales is the equivalent of 2 hours at the minimum wage. So for some people, it will be a matter of working a few extra hours. Now, I appreciate it's not an option for everyone, but it will be an option for some. For some who have the opportunity perhaps to do a part-time job and they're not currently, that will be what they do. For some, and she said, there are some who can't take in a lodger or a tenant, but there are some who can. I had a constituent ring me up. She said, I'm in a 3-bedroom house. I live on my own. I've just had one of these letters. What shall I do? We started talking, and she said, well, to be honest, my brother and sister-in-law would actually quite like to move in. You know, can we do that? Yes, you can. And then that is using that house to much better effect. It won't be right for everybody, but there will be a range of responses. And the system is geared so that if you have a boarder or if you have a subtenant, and most social landlords should allow you to, in an organised way, to have a subtenant, you get to keep at least the first £20 a week of the income. So these are all options. They won't work for everybody, but there is a range of options. Now, the Honourable Lady mentioned Bron Avon and Duncan Forbes, and I've looked at some of these case studies. I believe one of them is just wrong. The case that she mentioned of the ex-serviceman with a with a teenager who might go off to university, provided she's not away for more than 13 weeks at a time, she can have the bedroom. So that means that social landlords have got to be good at communicating with their tenants, and I've seen good examples, but I've also seen some bad examples. Now, the other examples may well be true, but I saw that one and it jumped out at me and I thought, that is not right. And he describes how distressed this man was. Now, someone here has a duty to make sure they know the rules. We have to communicate them effectively, but so do the social landlords. I've seen letters that social landlords have sent out that are excellent, that explain the rules and explain what discretionary housing payments are, and I've seen others that don't even mention discretionary housing payments. So we have to make sure social landlords up their game. Now, on the subject of discretionary housing payments, because that's crucially important, and Mr Robertson, it responds to a number of points made in the debate. Now, the Honourable Member for Torfan mentioned discretionary housing payments, and he quoted a figure of 50,000, 54,000 or something. The figure for the year we're talking about when this policy comes in for that local authority is not 50,000, it's 193,000. That's when the policy has come in. Now, clearly, the point of discretionary housing payments isn't to make up everybody's shortfall, or we wouldn't make any money out of the policy. We wouldn't be saving any money. But it is for the hardest cases. Now, there is an issue about whether you try and prescribe in primary or secondary legislation the exact categories of people who you exactly want to help. And the issue of people with major disabled adaptations is one. And we could have done that. But the second you do that, you're trying to define what is a substantial adaptation, and you have someone who you didn't think of who's just the wrong side of the line, and someone you didn't mean to include who's the right side of the line. So, for example, if someone's had stair lifts, extra rooms, widened doors, and all the rest of it, it's pretty obvious. On the other hand, if they just had a hand grip, it's pretty obvious. But what about all the ones in the middle? And rather than we in Whitehall trying to define for every local authority, for every sort of adaptation, this is in, this is out, what we've done is trusted local authorities. So we've given them money specifically for people who've had disabled adaptations, specifically for foster carers, which is another example, specifically for some of the other housing benefit changes. We've given them a pot of money and said, you know your local people, you on a case-by-case basis can meet someone. So if it's a lone parent who, or a separated parent who has the kids on a very regular basis and really needs that room and there's nothing else that can be done, they can go to the local authority. But we weren't going to try and prescribe for a DHP. We weren't going to try and prescribe in legislation, for example, you know, so many nights qualifies, this number of nights doesn't qualify. If you've got a possible arrangement for the kids, you can. You know, the idea is that the local authority treats people as individual human beings, meets their individual needs. Now, it isn't an unlimited pot. I really ought to respond to the Honourable Lady. Just because I've got other things to say in response to the point she's made. So what we tried to do is not prescribe in a rigid, central, one-size-fits-all way, but to make substantial extra money available so that people could respond to their individual needs. Yes, of course.
Except it's a very, very small pot of money compared with the amount of people we're talking about, and that actually, if the aim of this policy is to use the housing stock better and to save money, it's going to fail on both counts, because the pressure, as we've mentioned in Wales, and it'd be helpful if you address at this point, we've got very few, you know, we've got larger properties and very few smaller properties, and people are going to pay more in private rents.
Well, on the issue of whether people pay more in private rents, a lot depends on where the people who occupy the houses that have just been vacated come from. So, for example, if someone's in overcrowded private rented accommodation on which they're claiming housing benefit, and they move in to the reduced rent social housing occupation property, that saves us money. So a lot depends on the dynamics. This isn't a static situation. And she said, you know, this is not much money. But I mean, take her own local authority of Newport. Last year, 11-12, Newport got £47,000 towards DHPs. Next year, it will get over £250,000. Now, you know, she says it's not enough. Of course, it's not enough for everybody who will lose, because the policy is part of trying to reduce the deficit. Now, just to run through some of the other points she makes about the lack of suitable housing stock, this is a long-term issue which needs to be addressed. So housing associations, local authorities, when looking at the future housing stock, need to be looking at the unmet need. If there is lack, now of course there's a lead time on that, but if you just sit and wait, it will never happen. So this is a trigger, yes, to tackle the deficit, but a trigger for a much more rational allocation of the houses we've already got, but also a more rational building policy so that we build homes that meet the needs of the people we've got. And all too often in the past that hasn't happened, and it's time that it did. So she asks about the impact on Wales, and she's right that we're talking about 40,000 households. That's roughly the scale of what we're talking about. The average loss in Great Britain as a whole is around £14 a week. In Wales, because rents tend to be lower, it's around £12 a week. My honourable friend for Ceredigion mentioned the issue of rural communities. And can I say that we will be evaluating the impact of this policy over a 2-year period, but with interim reports, which we will publish, across England, Scotland and Wales, across rural, urban and suburban constituencies. As a consequence of the debates in the House of Lords on the bill as it went through, we agreed, and indeed, you know, we were well on the way to doing this anyway, proper evaluation of all of this. So if there are particular issues in Wales or in rural areas or whatever, we'll have the chance to respond to that. For example, by adjusting the allocation of discretionary housing payments. So that allocation has been set for 13-14, but not beyond. So if we learn things during the year, we can look at whether we need to change the allocation. We could change the rules of the scheme. Obviously, that's a more fundamental change. But we do have a lever, a fairly flexible lever, if we get early signs that there are particular problems in particular areas. We're trying to support social landlords. So we've worked with the Chartered Institute of Housing to produce a toolkit for landlords called Making It Fit that provides an overview of how different social landlords are responding. And I think, I'm sure, Mr. Robertson, the last thing I want to convey is this is easy for people, that there won't be people who find this difficult, that it isn't disruptive. But there is a difference between social landlords who engage, who get in there early, who get to know their tenants, for example, who go out and sit with their tenants and say, well, actually, you're claiming all the benefits you're entitled to. Could you be getting disability living allowance, for example, that would top up the household income? It's a chance to have a constructive engagement with tenants, to find out their needs, to find out what's happening. You know, there are many social landlords who don't know that their tenants aren't even there, or they're not subletting. A lot of beneficial things that need to happen could come as a result of this. Yeah, okay.
Would you accept that Bron-Avon, this report is precisely what they've done, is gone out and speak individually to every single person who's affected, and these, in that report, are the harrowing stories, personal stories that people are giving back to them?
I accept that they've been out and talked to their tenants, and if this has triggered that process, then that's a good thing. As I say, I have some doubts about at least one of the case studies, and some of the other case studies. I hope the housing associations explain what discretionary housing payments are. As I think from memory, another one had a disabled adaptation or something like that, and that's what the DHPs are for. So it certainly wasn't a criticism of Bron-Avon, but there are social landlords who are upping their game, who are engaging, who are trying to generate extra revenue through benefit take-up, who are being creative, who are looking at the private market, who are moving people around, and who are just accepting that this is coming and not sort of simply saying, oh, this is terrible, but actually doing something constructive. And any housing association or social landlord that does that, I welcome and deserves credit. So obviously, I've mentioned the discretionary housing payment money. The particular people we had in mind are people with disabled adaptations and foster carers, but the local authority has discretion to use it in individual cases. So, Mr Robertson, I don't belittle the impact that this will have. It is a significant change. We do need to save money, but we have the potential, I think, to make better use of our social housing stock, to deal with under-occupation but also overcrowding, to be fair between social and private tenants, and at a time when we're trying to take very large sums of money out of the housing benefit bill to deal with a vast and yawning deficit that wasn't dealt with, this is a place where we do need to look, but we need to manage the process, and that's what our research and our use of DHPs is designed to achieve.
Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.